Welcome to this Instituto Fe y Libertad event. There are many familiar faces here, but for those of you who don't know us, we are a think tank that works to advance human flourishing by promoting individual liberty and Judeo-Christian principles. So after 7 years, the Institute offers programs and seminars, as well as multiple resources for all types of audiences, including the academic journal Fe y Libertad. We have a podcast, we have a book club, a blog, online conversations, and much more. This year, we aim to study 4 main topics, and one of those is identity and community politics. And it is a real privilege to have Phillip Magness here with us today. Most people admit that they require a sense of identity to find a place in a given community, define their rights and responsibilities, and even perceive their sense of self-worth. Today, many people consider that their value comes from their supposed belonging to a gender, a religion, a race, an economic background, a social class, or to other external factors. There is a tendency to define identity in collectivist terms. Identity has become a really hot topic, not only because of the emergence of what is now called critical race theory, but also identity politics. In the classical liberal tradition, in contrast, there's a view, probably rooted in Judeo-Christian values, that human life is sacred in and of itself, regardless of categories such as sex or race. And in that tradition, people do not feel they have to create an identity from scratch, entirely based on temporal preferences and with no boundaries or limits whatsoever, but rather that our identity has been received. For people of faith from birth, our identity is determined by our relationship with God, both our Creator and Father, and in turn, it shapes our relationship with other people. And in that tradition, even non-believers tend to agree that humans share a certain natural attributes and that each individual has a vocation or purpose. So the upcoming issue of Revista Fe y Libertad, our academic journal, will center on identity and political community. And Phillip Magness' lecture today fits right in line with this, all the questions that we want to raise. So thank you, Phillip, for sharing light on these very difficult and controversial topics for us. Let me just say a little bit about you first, okay? Phillip Magness is Senior Research Faculty and Interim Research and Education Director at the American Institute for Economic Research. He is also a research fellow at the Independent Institute. He holds a PhD and MPP from George Mason University School of Public Policy and a BA from the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He has been a professor of public policy, economics, international trade at various institutions, including American University, George Mason University, and Berry College. Phil's work encompasses the economic history of the United States and the Atlantic world, with specializations in the economic dimensions of slavery and racial discrimination, the history of taxation, and measurements of economic inequality over time. He also maintains active research interest in higher education policy and the history of economic thought. In addition to his scholarship, Phil's popular writings have appeared in numerous venues, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Newsweek, Politico, Reason, National Review, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So the microphone is all yours, Phil. Thank you.
All right. Excellent. Good morning. And I'll start. I'm going to apologize. My voice is a little bit hoarse because they have been working me very extensively. I lectured all day yesterday, but I will plow ahead, and I am happy to be here. I'm thrilled to be here. This is a very lively topic right now, as we know from the media coverage, from the political conversation, from almost all debates that are taking place in academia. We've almost become suddenly obsessed with identity politics. It is the dominant theme in the humanities in general. If you read humanities journals, all issues talk about identity politics. There was even a movement that started about 2 years ago to do what they call decolonize the journals. And decolonization assumes that a journal has been colonized in the first place. And what did they mean by that? Well, they say historically, academic journals tended to feature mostly male and mostly white authors because that's what academia consisted of, especially 100 years ago. And the claim is to fix that, to rectify the wrong of unequal identity representation in academic journals, we now have to have different standards for different people, not based on their individual articles and contributions, but based on what gender they belong to, what race, what religion, what ethnicity, all the way down the list, all the identities. And journals announce that they intend to decolonize themselves. And what it means in practice, though, it's not engaging in respect for people based on their racial characteristics or based on their identity group that they belong to, based on their gender. It's not opening the doors to people that were historically excluded from those journals. Rather, what it is, it's the promotion of political beliefs associated with people strictly because they put their identity first. And it's often a very collective approach to political beliefs. Now, I mentioned this in academia. It spreads to the university classroom, it spreads to popular media, and it spreads to our politics. And one of the things I'm very critical of is the approach that identity politics tends to take. It reduces all action to the collective, to membership in a group. It says the individual has no say or place in that group. It's rather you are defined by your characteristics. But there's a trick here. We are all members of many groups. I can't even begin to say which identity group I belong to because I belong to dozens, maybe hundreds of identity groups. And I think that's true of almost everyone. You consider our own past, our own ethnicity. I could say I'm an American, but what does that even mean? My grandparents, two grandparents were immigrants from Ireland. Through Canada. My mother was an immigrant through Canada. My father was born in the United States, but his mother was from Mexico. How many identity groups have I just listed right there? Which one is mine? I don't know. In fact, I've embraced them all. I think they're all great. But I don't let that define my politics. I don't let that define my person. And I certainly don't let that define my economics. Here's the other interesting thing about identity politics is it's often a stand-in for economic ideology. And we think about this by going back to its academic roots, its intellectual roots. We've heard a lot about critical race theory recently. And I want to ask you, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can someone here define critical race theory for me? Any volunteers? No volunteers to define critical race theory. That's perfectly fine. I've asked that question to people that practice critical race theory, and they can't define it either. They say word games, basically, about racial discrimination, which is real. Racial discrimination existed historically and exists today. But then they don't really offer anything other than platitudes. They offer vague assertions about racial identity being a historical concept that changes and shapes the way that we acquire things, that we get things. But they don't really have a working definition of it. And one of the arguments that I make, both in my work and some of the more recent things that I've written, is that the definitional imprecision of critical race theory is intentional. And what do I mean by that? Is if you obfuscate, if you throw up broad platitudes that seem appealing, like saying racism is wrong, discrimination is wrong, the legacy of discrimination is still with us and needs to be addressed, that is a rhetorical strategy to get people to agree with you. And that's what they do. But then they turn and they pivot and they say, oh, well, you agree with me. You agree that the history of society is shaped by racial injustice, and I think we all can agree on that in this room. And they'll say, well, therefore we need to overturn capitalism. Therefore, we need radical redistribution of property and income in society. Therefore, we need a whole list of all these political beliefs that they want you to accept. They smuggle that in through the back door. This is an intentional rhetorical strategy. So here's the philosopher Henry Frankfurt wrote a great little pamphlet, book, essay, if you want to call it that. And I apologize for the vulgarity of the title, but it has a purpose. The title of the essay from Henry Frankfurt is called On Bullshit. He actually gives an academic definition of bullshit. He's not just saying, I'm going to trash these things, or BS. We'll use BS there. So, on BS. And what is BS to Henry Frankfurt? He says it's a rhetorical strategy of intentional deflection. It's not the same as deception, it's deflection. And what do you mean by deflecting? It's a rhetorical strategy where someone who has a weak position that's very difficult to defend on its own merits, on its own rights, if they were straightforward, if they were clear about laying out the intentions of that position. People would look at it and they'd shrug and say, I'm not convinced. And we see this in politics all the time. If you want to advance a weak position, you don't go and tell people that's your position because they laugh at you. They shun it. They set it aside. But he says a weak position can be obscured and made to sound like a sophisticated position by intentional deflection. And deflection doesn't lie about what the position is. It tries to hide what the position is. And it tries to hide it in platitudes or fake sophistication. So sophisticated sounding words to obscure a much simpler concept. And Henry Frankfurt says someone is engaging in BSing when they're not being straightforward about their designs or intentions, but rather are trying to lure someone to either accept or not challenge their position by obfuscating about what that position actually is. So really interesting design. And he's not saying this in particular, that critical race theory is BS or any other thing. He's saying this is just a general rhetorical strategy. He wrote this essay maybe about 20 years ago or so is when it came out. And he said, this is a new category of what we consider less than forthright, less than truthful rhetorical approaches. Because historically, when we say less than truthful, it means lying, outright deception. I tell you something that's false. I say, look over there, the sky is green. It's a lie. The sky is blue. Or if it's green, we got a problem. But if I were lying, if I told you something completely false to lure you in and try to deceive you, if I told you that as a thank you for attending this lecture, I am going to give everyone $100 at the end of the lecture, that would be a lie. I wish it wasn't a lie. If I could, if I had that money, I'd give everyone $100. I'd love to share $100, but I'm not wealthy. But if I told you that to make you stick around for the lecture and then I didn't deliver, that would be a lie, right? But what if I told you, if you come to my lecture, I'm going to tell you the truths and secrets of the universe that will make you better off and make you wealthy, and all you have to do is agree with me. And you won't realize it now, but maybe several months down the road, you'll realize that you were part of the system of thought that I conveyed to you in this classroom today. And if you just accept that, at some point in the future, wealth will be coming to you. Is that a lie? Or is that a deception engaged on deflecting what I'm actually up to here? In other words, it's a promise that I'm never delivering on, not a promise that I outright lied upon. So bullshit, or BS in Henry Frankfurt's terminology, is something that operates in this space. And I know this is a long deflection, but I want to use Henry Frankfurt's concept to understand what critical race theory is up to. You know, I mentioned that whenever I ask the question, can you define critical race theory? I never get a straight answer from proponents or opponents. Opponents of it, I give them a little slack because they're not advocating it. We can't expect them to know something that is not their position. But if you are a critical theorist, a critical race theorist, or a critical gender theorist, someone that espouses a collective ideology of identity politics, at bare minimum, intellectual integrity says I should be able to ask you what your position is, and you should be able to give me a clear answer. And yet they can't. So what do they do instead? Instead, they engage in word manipulation. They deflect away from the lack of clarity in critical race theory and instead accuse the person that questions it of being racist or being sexist or being opposed to whatever identity is discussed there. So that's the problem. And what it basically amounts to is says, either you accept my politics, you accept what I seek to achieve through identity politics and through the critical theory approach, or you're an oppressor, you're evil, you're a bad guy, and therefore I don't have to talk to you. I don't have to take you seriously. And in fact, I can seek ostracization and punitive action against you. And they do this. You see critical theory academics, identity politic academics, they're some of the most belligerent, mean, vicious, nasty, rude people you will ever encounter. They won't take your argument on its merits if it comes from outside of their tradition. They'll accuse you of things and call you names and dismiss you. They'll say you're an oppressor. And that's an intentional strategy. It's a bludgeon that says either come on board with what I believe or you will be ostracized. So back to the Harry Frankfurt concept. Remember I said Frankfurt talks about strategies of intentional obfuscation. One of these strategies is pseudo-sophistication, of inventing words, inventing novel concepts that have strange terminology that's only accessible to people that are trained in critical race theory or one of these other approaches to academic literature. And one of these terms is something we refer to now, because it's been established as part of the critical race theory literature, as intersectionality. Who's heard of intersectionality? Yeah, that one's popped up quite a bit lately. Does anyone know where that term came from? It was only invented in 1989. It's just over 30 years ago. Does anyone know what intersectionality means?
You're a victim in more than one sense.
You're a victim in more than one sense. I may borrow that. Well, does anyone know where it came from? So I've read the articles on intersectionality and participated in a forum on intersectionality, a discussion of it. I take it seriously. So Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who's one of the co-founders of critical race theory, she's in fact of the 3 or 4 main founders, she's the one that gave it the name, said we should call ourselves critical race theory. She's a law professor. And she wrote an article in 1989 that proposed a new theory. The new theory was called intersectionality. And she says, imagine a traffic stop, an intersection, a street. And there's red light, green light, cars coming from all different directions. And as you enter into the intersection, your experience is determined from the perspective or the point of entry into that intersection. But it's a different experience from the person that's coming from the crossroad. Right? And the more complex intersection you encounter, the more cars there are coming in different directions, and maybe for different reasons and at different speeds, they're all going to experience that interchange differently. It's a very simple concept in that sense. She says we can take this as a metaphor for various identities in society, including identities that have been discriminated against. She says, think about it in terms of race. A person of a certain race, and she's going to say a black person, an African American, may enter into an exchange in society, an intersection in society, in one way, but they're going to carry with them as they enter that intersection the perspective of a black person who has been part of a marginalized, discriminated against group. But wait a minute, there's a complexity here. What if that black person is female as opposed to male? They have another layer of discrimination that they've historically faced. So a black female will experience the exchange, the intersection, differently than a black male. What about a black female that's of a religious minority? A group that is not the majority in society? There's a third layer of the intersection. And these things in various ways stack up. And you can add religion, you can add ethnicity. Even within racial groups, there are different ethnicities and nationalities. You can have gender identity, sexual orientation comes in here. Almost every different line you could imagine has a component of an intersection. And basically all they're saying is that no single person is going to experience the same thing the same way, which could actually be a very individualistic way of talking about things. I mean, what's my intersectionality reference point? I'm an American, Canadian, Mexican, male economist from the United States that grew up in Texas and now lives in Massachusetts. We go through religious history where I have the family religious background that has covers everything from mainline Protestant to Unitarian to Roman Catholic. Where are the intersections there? And have all these identities been discriminated against at some point in history? Absolutely. I don't know if there's any other person that has the exact same identity as I do. And no one else in this room could claim the same thing. You all have your own individual identities, and there's no one else that has the exact identity you do. So it could be a very individualistic concept, but that's not how they use it. They use it as a way to rank order identities in terms of oppression. They say certain groups have been oppressed more than others, and they stack these things. And when I had this debate over whether classical liberalism, libertarianism had room for intersectionality theory, I argued no. The other side, several people on the other side argued yes, that we can use it in an individualistic way, as I just described. And they said, at the time, I said, intersectionality is not trying to stack or rank order identities. It's just simply acknowledging that they exist. So I pulled out the article from Kimberly Crenshaw, and I quoted it, and she has this passage, I paraphrase. She says, well, identities stack or rank order. This is part of intersectionality theory. So she basically refuted the notion that this could be done individualistically. But that's the very simple version of intersectionality. She says that people have different experiences based on different groups that they belong to. We can all agree on that. I can agree to that, right? I don't think that's controversial here. I would say that this is just a generic, almost banal reframing of something that has long preceded 1989 when she coined this term. We refer to this as methodological individualism. And methodological individualism also has other approaches as social science to understanding how identity groups work. Intersectionality describes identity groups descriptively. And therefore, it's a very abstract, simplistic, base level discussion of what an identity group is. You're black, you're white. You're of Hispanic or Latino origin, you're of Northern European origin, you're Catholic, you're Protestant, you're Muslim. Very base descriptive categories. And that's kind of the layer that they apply, and then qualitatively they attempt to interpret those categories, how they intersect with each other. And I'm a social scientist by background. Trained in policy, trained in economics, trained in social science techniques. Some of those techniques are statistical, econometric. And I sit here, read this article that's written in 1989. I start thinking, this sounds a lot like quantitative multivariate regression techniques, where you could code all of these different categories and put them into an empirical model and run that model to figure out if there's a societal effect that plays out differently by people belonging into multiple groups at the same time. And it turns out, yes, there is. Social scientists have been doing that for as long as computers and calculators have existed. We have a century or more of multivariate regression analysis that studies race and gender and religion and class background, ethnic background, all these different categories as empirical characteristics to see and detect if discrimination has occurred. So I ask the question, why do we need a new category called intersectionality theory? And I've never gotten a clear, convincing answer to that, other than regression analysis has a much higher level of evidence to meet to prove that discrimination has occurred across multiple intersecting lines. In other words, you have to have statistical significance. You can't just claim, oh, that person's black, female, and of a minority religious group, therefore we add them all up and that person necessarily faces more discrimination than a poor white person from a war-torn country. You'd actually have to run the numbers, put the evidence there. And that's where I think the faltering point is of identity politics and critical race analysis based on intersectionality, is it becomes a stand-in term for a really low-grade form of social science without evidence. It's social science by declaration rather than bringing statistics to bear to understand and get a better understanding of the real problems of discrimination. So that's what they do. They have a cheap, weak form of low-rigor social science built around a basic concept that could be turned and has been turned into very complex, sophisticated, and robust statistical analysis, but they eschew that. They say, no, we aren't going to do that because they already know the answers of how to rank order identity groups. Then, after declaring intersectionality to exist and layers of oppression to exist, they pivot and say we need to fix, to correct the discrimination that we have adopted. And conveniently, they know exactly what the corrective happens to be. It's income redistribution. It's massive government intervention in the economy. It may even be overturning capitalism itself. And in the early identity politics literature, the early critical race theory publications that started in the late 1980s and spread from Crenshaw coining this term to some of the other authors that they joined together. There's a great account from about 1995 by Richard Delgado, who's another critical race theorist. And he summarized the first conference where he got together with Crenshaw and Derek Bell and 3 or 4 of the other major figures of what we now call critical race theory. And Delgado openly says, he says, we were sitting around in a room trying to come up with a name for ourselves. And we realized, hey, this is a gathering of a bunch of Marxists. And they said it outright. They said, and we kind of laughed and talked about, yeah, we're a bunch of Marxists here. But they're not class-based Marxists. They're not proletarian versus the bourgeois, which is classical Marxism says there's an identity, a form of identity politics, but it has a very clear, strict dividing line. You have the masses, the disempowered class, and then you have the bourgeois on top, the exploitative class. It's a very clear, simplistic dividing line in society. And they're saying, well, no, that doesn't answer it all because we have to add race and religion and gender and all these other things, and they focus on race in particular, which actually angers a bunch of other types of Marxists. There are classical Marxists that dislike the critical theory Marxists and say, you're not real Marxists because you don't recognize class, you're trying to replace it by race. And they fight each other, they hate each other. It's notoriously schismatic. I like it. Who's ever seen the movie, the Monty Python movie, The Life of Brian? Mm-hmm. There's a great scene where Brian, the main actor, it's set in ancient Israel and right around the time of Christ. And Brian joins a group called the People's Front of Judea. And the People's Front of Judea, they're making it based on like a Marxist group, not only hates the Romans, but they're bitter enemies of the People's Judean Front, which is their little competitor group that believes on 99% of everything that they all share. And I liken these types of critical theory Marxists to classical Marxists. They agree on 99% of everything, but then they hate each other. And they spend all of their time like shooting and killing each other, and it's Stalin exiling and then executing, assassinating Trotsky. That's that type of a thing playing out over and over again. They aren't quite at that level of violence in academia, but you see it in those crowds. But back to the issue with intersectionality, it's rooted in Marxist theory of a new spin, a new type, a critical theory of a new type. It's not a class-based theory, but a race-based one. And there can be a gender-based one, there can be an ethnic-based one, a religious-based one. And so it's all stacking identities into the collective framework, but the end goal remains the same. What's the end goal? To overthrow the oppressors, and the oppressors are always capitalism. The oppressor is always economics. And we see this in the identity politics literature. We see this in the critical race theory crowd. And I found this in Crenshaw's work. They used to be much more explicit about it back in the 80s and 90s. Since they've become controversial, now they pretend that, oh, it's just innocuous. We're just trying to raise the issue of discrimination. And there isn't a political agenda here other than correcting discrimination. And yet, when they talk among their friends and in their academic journal articles, they do such things as make bold declarations that the entire field of what they deem neoliberal economics, which just means real economics to them, it's a pejorative term, they call neoliberal economics, is founded on white supremacy and colonial oppression. And if we've declared economics as inherently racist, we no longer have to take the economist's argument seriously. We can dismiss them outright as a product of oppression and as a power structure designed not to argue the merits of a free economy, not to argue the merits of private property rights and free and open exchange in bettering lives. We don't even have to consider that evidence anymore because we've deemed it racist and oppressive and really almost a game of trickery to convince people that are oppressed to accept the capitalist system. But once we dismiss it outright, we no longer have to engage its evidence because we have declared it the enemy. And therefore, the door is wide open to topple it, to overthrow capitalism, to correct it. And that's what they claim to do. This comes from the critical theory tradition, which actually does have something of a definition behind it. So I'll round out the lecture here because, I posed at the outset, how can you define critical race theory? And they don't have an answer. I'll try to give you an answer. And that comes from going back to the literature of critical theory itself. Critical theory is a term that's coined in the 1930s. And it comes from a couple of different social scientists, philosophers, that were based at the University of Frankfurt in Germany. They're known now as the Frankfurt School for that reason. The founding generation is not as well known as some of the later generations, but we still discuss them. Main figure is Max Horkheimer, and Theodor Adorno. And then they had a student, then colleague, Herbert Marcuse. And there's subsequent generations that are better known today that are Frankfurt School practitioners. And what Horkheimer in particular did, he writes an essay that juxtaposes critical theories against what he calls traditional theories. And he's drawing from a dense Marxist Hegelian background of conflict. Conflict is the mechanism that drives society in the Marxist system. Marx draws this from Hegel. We know that based on Marxist application of class conflict. The existence of conflict between classes is the driver of history. It's the contest for material possessions. The haves versus the have-nots and the denial of access to material possessions is the mechanism of conflict in the Marxist system. It sets the stage that the mechanism that drives history, that drives humanity forward, is how that conflict plays out. And then he thinks he has a scientific answer because he knows the numbers. Well, Horkheimer looks at this, and Horkheimer's writing, 60, 70 years after Karl Marx. Marx's predicted revolution has only come true in one place so far, that's Soviet Russia, and it's not turning out very well. He's writing in Germany, where very different problems are emerging. But they're trying to figure out why Marxism is not taking a hold in the West. And his argument is, he blames the persistence of traditional theories across society. And traditional theories are liberalism, empiricism, the Enlightenment, capitalism, frameworks for looking at things descriptively. And what he says is they purport to describe the world, but what they're really doing is propping up power structures in the world, propping up rationalizations for the existing division of goods between the haves and the have-nots, propping up inequality. So a traditional theory, according to this framework, masquerades as objective analysis. But what it really is a rationalization to try to delude people, to try to trick people into accepting the status quo. A critical theory, by contrast, he says, is emancipatory. It tries to overthrow the status quo. And part of the recognition there is coming to terms with the idea that the traditional theory is just basically a cover for the ruling class and needs to be overturned. So an emancipatory or critical theory is a very specific definition of emancipation. It's not freeing people, it is freeing the group analysis, the class analysis, who is the oppressed in the Marxist system. It's overturning the source of the oppression. So he says we need to develop critical theories that not only challenge traditional theory, but seek its upheaval in the academy and in public life and in government, that seek to throw it off and seek to do so including by means that are not on a level playing field, that doesn't treat it as something that's on a level playing field. And Horkheimer and Adorno and these other theorists of the 1930s, they write about these concepts almost entirely in terms of class. So fast forward again to the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when the critical race theorists come along and they're looking for a name for themselves, they say, well, we are a form of critical theory applied to race. So there's a functional definition of what critical race theory is. It's a form of critical theory in the classical sense, the old 1930s Marxist sense, a theory that seeks to emancipate by overturning traditional theories and casting them as institutions of the oppressing class, the oppressors over the oppressed, and says, but instead of a strict class line, we're operating on the lines of race, or the lines of race as it intersects with class in religion, in gender, and all these other identities. So to bring us to a conclusion, if a critical race theory is a critical theory applied in the terms of a dividing line of race, and an objective of any critical theory is to emancipate by throwing off the traditional theory, throwing off the claimed power structures of the oppressive institutions of society, the oppressing class over the oppressed, then by definition, a critical race theory has embraced a certain form of political ideology as a truism. It smuggled it in through the back door. It said that this is our answer. And therefore, the logical conclusion of a critical race theory is necessarily a collective left-wing Marxist policy answer for what to do with society. They used to admit this outright. They used to embrace it. Now they try to obscure because they engage in the tactics of Harry Frankfurt's designation of BS. But at its core, we do see critical race theory as a form of Marxist or collective analysis. And I'll end on there and would welcome any questions or comments.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm sure you figured a lot of questions.
Probably, yeah.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
When you talk about social science and influence and how identity relates to beliefs without setting aside what is true and what you think.
Right. And that's the trick here, because we're dealing with an ideology or a method of approach that is inherently intolerant of things that differ from it. And you think about this, it goes back to the classical Marxist framework. What was Marx's great claim about history? He had brought what he called to be science to the previously utopian study of socialism. He rejected the utopian socialists before him and says, I am a scientific socialist. And what was his claim? What was the science he said he had uncovered? Well, he had figured out the class dividing lines of society, and he thought by figuring them out, he could predict with extreme accuracy where history was going, what was inevitable about society, and that was the class upheaval. The proletarians would seize the means of production at some point and displace capitalism. He already knew that answer was a given. And if you already know a certainty about society because you think you've scientifically figured it out, when you start agitating to bring that into existence, you are no longer causing it to happen. You are just making reality fulfill itself in your own mind. And therefore, you don't have to pay any attention to anyone that would challenge and say, no, maybe you misdiagnosed this. You got it wrong. And Marx was very notorious about this. He was a dogmatic thinker. And what he did over his lifespan is every time there was a minor upheaval or looked like a revolution was fomenting over anything, he would try to reinvent that revolution through the lens of Marxist analysis, Marxist upheaval. So he saw it in 1848 with the revolutions in Europe. He said, this is our moment. And that's when he writes the Communist Manifesto. He saw the American Civil War. And he said, this is the start of the revolution. They're about to throw off the bourgeois. But it didn't play out that way. When the Paris Commune happened in 1871, Marx is watching it from London. He says, the revolution's imminent. And he cheers it on. And then it falters and it gets quashed. And he has to come up with a rationalization of why it didn't work that time. It's over and over and over again, always looking for the next revolution, until finally they get one that's successful, which was Lenin. And Lenin says, Marx was right. See, we just proved it. Because our revolution was successful, it's finally our moment. Well, the critical race theory crowd takes a very similar approach. And I know this is a very long answer, but I think it's important to realize is what they see is outside criticism that comes from external to this new spin on a really old dividing line conflict analysis ideology, a new spin on Marxism, basically. They see anything that's outside of it is not worthy of engaging on honest terms because they've already deemed it to be wrong. They've already claimed that they've scientifically divined the answer of what society should be and where it has to be going. And therefore, anyone that challenges it is just part of the oppressor, part of the obstacle that needs to be pushed away.
I have a question. Because I've been engaging in these conversations about critical race theory basically since 2017, and I have come to experience a problem in my conversations very, very recently, but it took me a while to figure it out. And I am certain that there is no available means of good discussion if we don't find common ground.
Yeah.
Be it in this discussion or in any discussion. Yeah. And you talk about how intolerable people tend to be on that aisle. But I have found that we are also very tolerable. And usually the people that are tolerant to those ideas, they express themselves in a very intolerable way. So it's not that they don't engage, they don't want to engage, but the way we speak signals to them that we don't want to engage. So where is our common ground?
That's the real trick. I think you're on a real paradox here, and I'll go even further. Herbert Marcuse, who's another critical theorist, he writes an entire essay and says we should be intolerant of ideas that fall outside of our framework. He says tolerance itself is a form of repression. And in a liberal society, I mean, tolerance is a virtue. It's a value. The classical version of toleration that came out of the Enlightenment, came out of the late 18th century, was not, we have to accept all ideas around us. It was more a mode of reasoning. And the way that this was stated, and you see this in some of the philosophers, Adam Smith hints at it, David Hume definitely hints at it. Some of the lesser-known figures, so the classical version that I draw on is Charles James Fox, who was he was a member of Parliament in the UK, a liberal leader. And he said, toleration is the process of thinking that works through deduction, that works through evidence, that starts from a point of humility and assembles evidence to figure out the answers. Remember David Hume, the famous skeptic? What's his whole approach? He's saying to society is, look, all these people around me, you say you know everything. You say you know how causality works. You say you know divine religious rule, divine law. You know the king's law. You say you have all the answers to society, and Hume is saying, no, you're all ignorant. And I'm the only one that's figured out that we're ignorant. And that's our condition in this world. We don't know anything. Knowledge is very, very hard to come from, so we have to build it up. And we have to build it up very carefully. And what does Hume do? By studying patterns in history, he says, well, there's a lot of messy stuff that happens in history. There's a lot of oppression, death, violence, societal collapse. But we also see patterns over time. And I think one of the patterns that seems to stop people from killing each other is clear constitutional order, clear law. And the law is not always the just law, but it is clear. Rules. Property is another thing. If we have clear, well-defined property, it stops people from killing each other. And I think we can assume on a basis that killing each other is bad. Maybe there's something to these property. He doesn't know exactly the mechanism, but he does know from very simple patterns you can deduce, you can build a more coherent evidence-based theory. And I know this is a long answer, but I do see some on the critical theory side as rejecting this methodological approach. And unfortunately, that breeds an intolerance on their side, and then we come in and we say, oh, well, I know capitalism's the answer. It can be seen as similarly intolerant. But I think we have to be patient and explain from that position of humility what are the steps of how we acquire knowledge, and in that condition of humility, discover bits and pieces of knowledge that seem to play out in patterns in ways that make society more peaceful, more livable, less violent, less destructive. So does that help as something of an answer? I know it's very abstract.
It's very abstract. Can I follow up? You mentioned one thing that is exactly the thing that I have found common ground on, but I'm curious about your opinion on it. I think the law is unjust.
Absolutely.
And I think they think so too.
They do. They do.
Why are we talking about that?
Good point. Very good point. When I say the law is unjust, I look at institutions that have been co-opted by political interests and used not to help all of society, but to help those who have the power, the votes. We go back to Hayek's work, his work on constitutions. He proposes a concept called the generality norm. What's the generality norm assert? Uniformity in law is a mechanism to bring fairness to society. So by definition, an unjust law, an unfair law, is violating the generality norm. And there are even extensions of Hayek, and this comes from Hutt and Buchanan and Hayek himself. There's a great little interview Hayek did in 1971 where he spells it out, and Buchanan is talking to him. And they come to a conclusion. They say, a generality norm of non-discrimination needs to be the constitutional basis of almost any society. Because if you prevent discrimination, you rule it out on a constitutional level, then think about this. What are you doing? You're not only ruling out laws that say this group is excluded and this group is favored based on their race or their gender or whatever it happens to be. You're also ruling out laws that bestow favor on one group by taking it from another. But that assumes that you're starting off sort of from an equal or an even perspective, and what these groups are saying is we need to redress past abuses, and that's really tough.
Yes, right.
And this is where I think we can draw on economic theory. So again, that's something I don't know the easy answer to, because injustices of the past, I mean, you're stacking up millennia of problems. How do you redress that? I mean, how do you address a property claim based on land that was stolen in 1502? Everyone that was involved in that's long dead, but it has repercussions today. How do you adjust for that? And I mean, do you figure out who the land passed to in 1503, and then again in 1570, and then in 1920, and you could trace it all the way back? I mean, sometimes those records don't even exist.
That happens a lot here, right?
Yeah. And there's also an incentive to lie about it. If you think that you're at risk of losing your land and you lie and you claim, oh, well, I found an old record that said that my ancestor actually did pay this person for it, and you can no longer claim it. Or and you even see this on groups that were oppressed. They expand the claims of their territory, of what is owed to them. And like historically, they may have been involved, may have owned a very small area of land, and then suddenly they start to claim that they owned a very large area of land. And there's no record of it. So how do you address that injustice? An economist would say, well, we can establish fair institutions going forward and clear property rights going forward, and use that as a basis to move toward a more equal distribution in society. Because we know that once the property rights are clear and transactions are clear, we have at least stopped the process that created the initial injustice. That doesn't answer everything, but it's a footing. Whereas, and this is where I think we do diverge from the critical race theory perspective, they say the past was unjust things were done, distribution was unfair, and to correct that, we need a different type of unfair distribution in the present, meaning we appropriate things from people that have too much and give it to people who don't have enough. Whether the people that have too much were culpable or not. And in most cases, they're not culpable, because the original perpetrator's long since dead. But saying, oh, you're wealthy today, and you may have made your wealth on your own, but there are poor people today, so we can take your wealth and give it to the poor people, not because you wronged the poor people, but because you're in a class that historically was the perpetrator of the original wrong 300 or 400 years ago. So they say, use a reverse discrimination to correct an original discrimination, whereas we say, stop discrimination and find a way forward. I know that's a bit of a long answer to him.
Some of the effects of this critical race theory and identity politics, some of the policy prescriptions are very absurd. And I think that a lot of the things that have been happening might spur people into questioning, the how sound is this? When you're toppling statues and you're creating segregated graduation ceremonies, and you're rewriting history books. Are people starting to react to some of this nonsense?
It is. And the statue toppling stuff is really, is both horrifying, but it's interesting to watch. And I've studied this in the United States. I actually quantified, I put together a database of all the Civil War statues in the United States. And there are about 8,000 of them Both, and I only looked at the Confederate ones, but the Union ones. And it turns out that every town in America that was involved in the war built a statue to its soldiers. That's what they did, because the veterans come home and they're like, we need a veteran parade, and then they unveil a statue. But the movement to topple them was based in symbolism more than redress of justice. And we know this because as they started toppling statues, there were all these Union statues in the north of the United States. And the people that were involved in these movements, the upheaval movements, the critical race theory crowd, they go out in the streets and they protest, and they look around and there's no Confederate statues in the north. So what do? They see a statue of a soldier and it's a Union soldier, and then, there's a statue, and then they pull it down. They pulled down statues of Abraham Lincoln. They pulled down statues. There was one Frederick Douglass statue that got toppled. They had no idea who the guy was. He's the abolitionist. The black abolitionist had his statue toppled in Rochester, New York. Just because the mob was trying to engage in an act of symbolism. And I think this is a greater representation of some of the problems that come out of this literature, because they've injected how they write about history into the history profession. They take these approaches to writing about history and they insert it into history books. And because it's all about symbolism, that means facts don't matter anymore. It means evidence isn't necessary because you already have the symbolic divide of society figured out, and you can assert, well, here's the oppressor and here's the oppressed. So they make factually inaccurate claims to justify the politics of today, and they never get challenged on it. And when you do challenge it, you say, oh, well, you're racist or you're sexist. And I find this utterly maddening. I've spent the last 3 years battling this stuff with the New York Times. And I tackled my battle not so much as a political campaign against some of the 1619 projects, the big public face of this right now. And it's a U.S.-centric thing, but it has global implications. But the very first thing I did after that came out, it wasn't to denounce it and say this is wrong and this is critical race theory ideology.
So, sorry, can you explain a little bit? So maybe someone doesn't know about the 1619 project.
So this was the New York Times in 2019, on the 400th anniversary of the first slave ship that arrived in an English colony. They announced a history project to investigate and reimagine the history of the United States. And it's all done through this critical race theory perspective of the oppressors versus the oppressed. And it elevates this question of slavery into the center of everything. And they rewrite American history based on this. And I'm like, okay, fine. Yes, they're going to do that, and they're writing from an ideological perspective. But I asked the question, are their facts correct? And I happen to study this area. I worked on slavery very extensively, lecturing on it tonight in class. Written books and articles and dozens of things on this. And I start reading it, and I see basic factual errors, stats that are wrong, historical claims that never happened. I write the newspaper to start addressing these. And I say, you can make your argument, that's fine, but this fact on page 7 is an error. This source is misused. Here's the original source. You can compare the two. Put them side by side. And you can see what's written here, and you see how you depicted it, and it's wrong. If you're going to make an ideological argument, at least make it on a factual basis. And they say, it doesn't matter. We're going to ignore it. Anyway, the answer I got on multiple times, I think I've had 4 separate direct attempts to change the New York Times to get them to issue a correction per their own corrections policy. And each time they say, well, that's just a difference of interpretation. And I said, no, this is a date. This is a stat. This is GDP. This is the text. So it's almost a comedy of absurd events. But that's come with the methodology, is when you have the narrative, you can shun facts and throw them off when they get in the way. where you can bend them and manipulate them. And that's what I think we see in the statue smashing, the rewriting of history worldwide. But it's also, and here's the giveaway. It's a selective rewriting of history. Karl Marx has never been canceled. Has anyone ever read Karl Marx's writing on race and religion? He is an outright bigot, a white supremacist, a radical white supremacist. He believed in his own genetic superiority. He studied race science. He studied, this is when Charles Darwin is his contemporary. They're discovering evolution. He studied the type of evolution that asserted certain races were superior to other races. And we see it in his private letters to Frederick Engels. So one of the people I mentioned yesterday in the lecture, the competitor socialist, was a French-German political figure by the name of Ferdinand Lassalle. And he was a democratic socialist. He said, we can achieve this through the legislature. And he was actually very respected. I think Otto von Bismarck, who's very much outside of this world, later wrote and said, Lassalle was one of the most amazing intellectuals I've ever encountered. Very smart, well-respected guy. But Marx considered him a competitor for control of the socialist movement. Lassalle was part African in his ancestry. And he had African features. He had curly hair and facial features. He was also part Jewish in his ancestry. Marx writes a letter about Lassalle to Engels. And he says, that Jewish N-word is basically ruining our movement. And we can tell the inferiority of his intellect from his ill breeding, from the cross-mixing of races in his parentage. And I'm summarizing the letter here. And that's the reason we should dismiss him. Marx does this on multiple occasions. When he's writing about the American Civil War in public, he says, the revolution is occurring. When he writes privately about it to Engels, he says, the black people don't know what's best for them. And he uses a different term for black people.
There's a good book. Yeah. That would be an excellent contribution.
Yeah. And it's not just black people he hates. He has anti-Semitic essays. He basically writes about Jewish people being hoarders of money. And it's weird because he's part Jewish himself, but he doesn't want to acknowledge that, and he wants to repudiate it. He thought Hispanic races in particular were lazy and of a tropical climate. And other Marxists did that. When the United States fights Mexico in the Mexican-American War, the United States acquires California. Marx writes to Engels and he says, good, I'm glad the Americans won because the Mexicans were too lazy to know what to do with it. And you're reading this, it's like, this is the guy that's the chief theorist that they're all drawing on? Why aren't they tearing down the Karl Marx statue? He's an actual racist. He's an oppressor. He's an awful, awful human being. Marx never gets canceled. John Maynard Keynes never gets canceled. Keynes was the president of the Eugenics Society. Really ugly, awful stuff. And this is over and over and over again. Joan Robinson, who's the socialist economist. And we know a bit about her because she develops monopsony theory. She's obviously very brilliant, but she's really in vogue right now by the political left because they use monopsony theory to argue for and justify the minimum wage. Well, Joan Robinson, later in life, she moved away from writing about economics so much on the left and started to get into political activism, and she became buddies with Mao Zedong and thought that he was going to be the great liberator of the world and traveled to China and writes basically propaganda for his regime. And then she starts visiting all the other communist states. She comes back from Cuba and she's asked the question about what's the future of communism in Cuba. And she says, well, I'd like to think that it would be great because they copied China's route and Russia's route, and China and Russia are supposedly doing communism right. She even says North Korea is achieving communism the right way, writing in the 1960s. We saw how that one turned out. But she says, I'm worried about Cuba because it's of Hispanic and African origin, and I don't think they are up to the task of imposing a socialist society. So you're reading this stuff, and it's like, these people are outright racists. And they've built it into their theory. They never get canceled. And that, to me, is the real giveaway that this is not an honest form of trying to reconcile with racial wrongs of the past. It's rather weaponizing the use of race as a bludgeon to exterminate the other side's argument from discussion and elevate their own. Yeah.
I have a question. First of all, thank you so much for your lecture. From the organization I work for and represent, we focus so much on the family as a structure and the benefits it gives to whole societies. I wrote my question so it's easier to understand. So, as you said, there's influence of these critical race theories in all spaces: language, education, media, and politics. These kind of theories and ideologies had a hard time trying to be accepted in Hispanic countries like ours, mainly because most of the population share values and the religious values too, but also because most populations have family as the most important institution for them. How do you consider these theories can affect in a negative way the family as an institution in the future, or how are they affecting that?
Absolutely. And that's a complex question. There's a lot going there. And you see that religion is often targeted as one of the institutions that they say is oppressive, that they want to overturn. And they attack it two ways. They'll attack it externally, which was the Marxist way, saying that religion's is the opiate of the masses. It's something that needs to be overturned. But there are also derivatives of this line of thinking that have tried to appropriate or repurpose religion. And I know this is a whole new lecture, liberation theology. I'm sure we've all encountered, which tries to reinvent the story of Christ as the story of like this Marxist revolutionary. So there are two strategies they take on: either to attack religion from the outside or co-opt it from the inside and distort and reappropriate and change its message. And both are very insidious weapons. One's a heresy, it eats at the faith. The other is outright oppositional destruction, an attack. I don't know if there's an easy answer to warding off either, other than pointing out that the one reason why religion gets a target painted on it is the fact that it props up institutions that are impediments to this identity politics divide. It props up the family. It props up a dignity of the individual as a part of a human community. Religion supports that. Our theological doctrines were at the center of eliminating slavery because it was seen as in conflict with Christianity. Slavery was sinful. There's a reason why the pulpit was where the abolition movement started. The oppression of indigenous peoples. The original advocacy for indigenous populations almost always comes from priests who see them being wronged by the political figures. And I'm not saying there's a perfect history there. There are also people in religious institutions that do bad things. There were people in religious institutions that tried to justify slavery. But there was a religious ethic that fought past oppression on an individual basis, an individual dignity basis. Identity politics sees that as a competitor, because the individualism doesn't serve them any. In fact, it undermines them. So.
Well, I think we're going to end there.
All right.
Thank you very much.
It's a little bit of a depressing topic, but...
Thank you very much, Phil. We really, really appreciate your illuminating remarks, and We hope that all of you will consider maybe writing for or participating in the making of Revista Fe y Libertad's next issue on identity politics. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.